Namaste and good morning to all of you. Let's start the class with the prayers. Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parbrahma, Tasmai Shri Guruve Namah. Om Bhu Bhava Swaha, Tat Savitra Varenyam, Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi, Diyo Yo Nah Prachodayat. Asto Ma Satgamya, Tamso Ma Jyotirgamya, Mrityorma Amritam Gamya. Om Sena Vavatu, Sena Bhunaktu, Saviryam Karvavahi, Tejasvinavadhitamastu, Ma Vidvishavehi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Last week we started reading from this book, the great epic Mahabharata. And we learned how the author of this great epic, Rishi Vyas, how was he born? And if you remember, his father's name is Rishi Prashar, and mother's name Satyavati. Okay, and that name was given to her by Rishi Prashar. He said, "You will be called that, Satyavati." Okay, because before that she was called Matsya Gandhi, because there was a smell of a fish always from her body. But after that encounter, she smelled like jasmine flowers. A yojan all around where she was. A yojan is 8 miles. So that far away. And that's how that King Shantanu, we'll see that how he gets attracted to her. But today we're going to start the reading from chapter 2, A Tale of Two Curses. Because we saw that how Shantanu, the king Shantanu of Hastinapur, he got married to Ganga. And how the baby was born and she'll take the baby away. Because she got the promise from the king that whatever I do, you'll never question me. So let's see how this chapter goes. A Tale of Two Curses. Never once did Shantanu ask his queen why she had drowned their child. Not even in their most intimate moments together. In a year, she was pregnant again. Once more, there was expectation and rejoicing in the kingdom. And once again, when she was delivered of a beautiful infant, she took the child to the river and threw him to the foaming currents. Again, Shantanu followed her and found her at the water's edge. Once more, she made him dumb with a look, smothering him with her loving, so he dared not ask her why she had killed their baby. 7 times in as many years, Ganga became pregnant because her husband did not stop loving her. But living with his terrible secret, his heart died within him day by day. They told the world their sons were born diseased from an old curse and had been given into a care of some rishis in the forest. This was near enough the truth, but Shantanu did not know that yet. Like a serpent in its hole, his anguish coiled itself around his life. His hair turned grey and his face was lined. He tried to stay away from Ganga, but this he could not do. She was closer to him than his very breath. And he could not live without making love to her. He bore his ordeal in silence through the murder of 7 sons. But slowly Shantanu arrived at a crisis. What tormented him most, whenever he thought of it, was his queen's nonchalance at what she did, which was so monstrous. He often wondered whether she was not a Rakshasi, a demoness. After all, her past was cloaked in mystery. Even on that first day they met, he recalled now in dark suspicion. She had made him swear he would never question her, on pain of losing her forever. Yet, He also knew how gentle she was, even to the smallest living thing. How was he to reconcile these two Gangas? Shantanu was close to losing his mind when his queen conceived for the eighth time. The time of her delivery drew near, and this time Shantanu waited night and day outside his wife's apartment. He listened, as he could not have done in the past, to her cries of labor as the child pushed his way out from her delicate body. It was the night's final yam, the hour before dawn. Shantanu heard her order her chariot to the door, and he knew where she would go. That night, Shantanu rode to the river before her. For an hour, he waited by the murmuring water until dawn caressed the eastern sky. It was the longest hour of his life. Then he heard her arrive. By the first rays of the sun, he saw her alight from the chariot with their child in her arms. He stood hidden by a tree, and she did not notice him in her urgency. She ran straight to the edge of the water, and as she lifted the baby to cast it into the lightning flow, all the sorrow of 7 agonized years burst from him. Stop, howled Shantanu, his voice echoing against the dawn. You won't kill my son. It was as if he had struck her with an arrow. She turned in shock, a moan on her lips, and stood frozen as he ran up to her. Before he could snatch the child from her arms, she handed it to him herself. He was beside himself now, raging. What is this dreadful thing you do again and again? How can a mother cut off these innocent lives? She smiled sadly. You have broken your oath to me. It seems you need this son of yours more than you do me. So be it. The curse has ended. What curse? What are you raving about, you murderess? He saw hurt flash in her eyes. Then she took his hand. My lord, hear my story before you judge me. Stroking his face so tenderly he thought his heart would break, she whispered, Look, Shantanu, at who I really am. She stood transformed before him. She was ethereal light and crystal waves at once. The tides of ages were contained in her. She was pure beyond belief, brighter than the rising sun. She was a goddess. He drew back from her in awe. She, who had been his wife for 10 years, stood now an immortal. She said, I am Ganga, the river of heaven and earth. The sins of men are washed in me. Shantanu stood speechless. He wanted to kneel and worship her, but the child was in his arms, and confusion stormed through his body. In a moment, she returned to her human form. Now you will believe me and my tale of two curses. The first curse is the reason I came to you as a woman. Once in a time, you cannot remember, since this mortal body binds you now, you were another king. You were called Mahabhishek then. As Ganga spoke, the memory of another life rustled at Shantanu's soul, and he saw what she described in a vision. Once Mahabhishek sat in Indra's court, the Sudharam among the Devas. Those were the days when heaven and earth were hardly apart from each other, and kings of the earth went freely to the realms of the gods. Ganga came there then, as she often did, and then Mahabhishek saw her. He wanted her. When she looked at him, she also felt a powerful yearning. The Devas saw them quicken to each other, and a hush fell in Indra's court. As Ganga told her tale, Shantanu saw it all again clearly. He was swept back to that unearthly occasion. How could an immortal like her and he, a mortal king, come together? The Devas cursed them that they dared gaze at each other with forbidden desire in the god's very presence. They cursed Mahabhishek and Ganga to a human life. When they would be a king, and his wife for a time and satisfy themselves with each other's love. And I appeared before you at my water's edge one day, she said. He asked in a whisper, and the children, what curse was that? She said in her voice of tides, once the 8 Vasus of heaven came down with their women to roam the earth. With invisible bodies, those immortals came and saw a mountain where Vashisht the sage had his ashram. They saw Nandini, the Muni's cow, with her calf beside her, cropping the grass that grew on a jade slope. They were besotted with that divine cow that lit up the mountainside with her luster. One of the Vasu's wives cried to her husband that she must have the creature for herself. The Vasu laughed. Nandini belongs to the Rishi Vashishta, who is master of this mountain. My love, a human may escape death by drinking her milk, but we are already immortal. It is foolish to tempt the sage's wrath. But his woman would not listen. It's not for me, but for a mortal friend of mine that I want the cow. My friend is dearer to me than I can tell you, and I don't want her ever to die. Taunted by their wives who brought their husband's manhood into question, asking, how could they? Who were gods? Fear a mere rishi? Those Vasus came down like 8 comets on that mountain and took Nandini and her calf from Vashish's ashram. But Nandini was like Vashish's daughter. He could not live without her. The Muni was a seer of time. He looked into his heart and knew the Vasus had taken his cow. When he saw how his gentle animal had been spirited away, crying out, her calf, lowing in terror, his eyes blazed. With all the power of his long tapasya, he cursed the Vasus. Arrogant Devas, be born as mortal men. He felt drained. In their distant world, the Vasus became aware of the curse and they trembled. It was unthinkable for them, who were as free as light, to be bound in flesh. They flew up to the Rishi's feet with Nandini and her calf and cried, Muni, forgive us. But a Rishi's curse was no trifle that it could be withdrawn. Moreover, the germ of a deep destiny was hidden in that curse. There were mysterious designs to be accomplished by it on earth. Vashisht had grown calmer now and felt pity for the contrite Vasus. He said, I cannot withdraw the curse, and you must pay for what you did. But for 7 of you, let the curse be brief. You will spend 9 months in the darkness of a mother's womb, but as soon as you are born, you will meet your deaths and be free again. It was the 8th Vasu, Prabhas, who had actually seized Nandini. He stood with his head hung before Vashishta. The Rishi said kindly to him, you led the others to sin. You must pay more fully than they. Prabhas, you will live a whole life as a man on earth and yours shall be a great human life. But now, Devas, go and find a woman who can be your mother in this world. The curse and even its softening had exhausted Vashisht. He had to find a lonely place to begin his tapasya once more. Taking Nandini and her calf with him, he disappeared from there. Left alone on the mountain, the Vasus saw a sparkling spring that issued from a cleft in some rocks. They knew this was from where the Ganga flowed down into the world. It struck them that here surely was Providence trying to show them their way ahead. Who better than the river of heaven and earth to be their terrestrial mother? They worshipped her on the icy mountain, and surprised at their being there, Ganga appeared before them. Already like children, the Vasus fell at her feet and cried, Devi, listen to the curse Vashisht has laid upon us. They told their tale by turns. At last, Prabhas said, we beg you, O Ganga, take a human woman's form, marry a king of the earth. and become our mother. And as soon as we are born, cast the first 7 of us into your waters. But I, Prabhas, must suffer the whole span of immortal life. Ganga ended her story softly. With the other curse already hanging over me, Shantanu, and longing for you as I did, how could I refuse? Now Shantanu knew she was pure. He knelt before her and asked her forgiveness that he had doubted her. Then, without a word, he handed her the shining infant he held in his arms. Tenderly, she took the child, the Vasu Prabhas, from him. Ganga said, when he is 16, our son will return with you to Hastinapur. And one day he will rule the Kurus. Shantanu realized the time had come for her to leave him. He cried, and you, Ganga, will I never see you again? What if I come to the river? Won't you meet me here in secret, hidden from the eyes of men and gods? Oh, how will I live without you? Briefly, she was sad, but then she stroked his face and said, nothing is hidden, nor ever shall be. Our time together is past. With the child in her arms, she vanished. Shantanu's cries rang against sky, forest, and river. Again and again he called out her name, but she had gone. In a while, knowing his old life was truly over, he climbed wearily into the chariot in which she had driven here and turned home. Chapter 3, The River's Son. For 16 years, Shantanu lived alone like a hermit in his palace. He turned all his attention to his kingdom. The rule of Shantanu, son of Pratip, of the house of the moon, was just and prosperous one, and his people were contented. More than anything else, he was a sad man. But his very sorrow seemed to give Shantanu strength and wisdom, so his reign could be a finer one than before. The king had one pleasure he still indulged in, hunting. But now Shantanu never killed any creature. He only watched their wild lives as an avid spy. Most of all, his hunting took him back to the place beside the river, where to his mind he had found and lost everything. Whenever he came there, he would grow strangely peaceful, as if he sensed her presence near him. Though not once did she appear before him for 16 lonely years. But he would set himself down at the deep flowing waterside and lose himself in the murmuring of her currents and the mists that clung and drifted across her expanse. And it was as if she reached incorporeal fingers through daylight and darkness and took his pain from him. 16 years passed, and one day Shantanu fell asleep beside the Ganga, dreaming of the past. He saw her standing before him once more, stroking his face with her cool hands, smiling at him, calling him with her eyes and with open arms. It was midday. Shantanu dreamt that the river had stopped flowing. The king woke up and saw the dream was true. The Ganga was dry beside him, a short way upstream. All her water had gathered in a huge wave. Froth flecked and swelling higher every moment, but powerless to flow. Shantanu saw an exceptional dam across the river, which she could not breach. It was a filigree wall of golden arrows, a brilliant net through which no drop of water passed. He heard a soft laugh at his back and whirled around. There she was, her face wreathed in a smile. Shantanu cried, so you have decided to take pity on me. Shall we go back to the palace? Shall we tell the people their queen has come home? But she said, all that is past. When the sun sets on one day, who can call him back so you can live the same day again? There is no returning, not a moment may we retrieve. Turn your heart away from what is over. Something in her voice startled him. He realized what she said was true. Moreover, he felt changed himself by the years. Now that he knew who she was, he felt worshipful towards her. Shantanu struggled briefly with himself. Then, growing calm, he asked, "Why have you come back?" "Do you see the river, my lord?" she said, a laugh in her fluid throat. "Yes," he breathed. "Who has done this?" He also smiled. He did not quite know why, except that a great happiness was dawning on him. Wryly, he added, "Who holds your tameless flow in check, which all my love could not bind?" Before she could answer, there was a deafening report. The dam of arrows gave way, and the immense wave that had built up behind it came roaring down the empty riverbed. A youth who shone like a god rode that cataract effortlessly at its crest. Ganga called out in her river tongue to the boy. He turned towards them, laughing in exhilaration, walking on the water as if he trod solid ground. He gained the bank, ran flushed and breathless to the river goddess, and flung his arms around her. "Mother, did you see? I held the river up again." Only then he seemed to notice Shantanu. He looked at the king with his great dark eyes, uncanny recognition sweeping across his heart. The young face was a picture of confusion as delight and disbelief chased each other across it. Laughing, Ganga said, "My child, this is your father, and this is our son, Devrata." The boy prostrated himself at Shantanu's feet. With a cry, Shantanu raised him up and embraced him. Ganga said, "Devrat is 16 today, and he knows everything a prince should know. Vashishta taught him the Vedas and Vedangs. Brihaspati taught him politics, and at my begging him, the bane of the Kshatriyas, Parshuram himself taught him archery. I do not think the Kurus will find a better heir for their ancient throne than my Devrata. He is a Kshatriya, my lord. Take him with you to your kingdom of heroes." The boy stood beside his father, bright with the sense of the destiny that was upon him. Though his eyes were full, he embraced his mother in farewell, unflinchingly. Smiling bravely, holding back her tears, Ganga vanished. Arm in arm, father and son turned back towards Hastinapur and the future. Shantanu was full of joy. So this ends the third chapter. So let's look at the fourth chapter, Ascent of Heaven. 4 perfect years went by. Shantanu named Devrat Yuvraj, the heir apparent. The people were delighted because they saw what a prince Ganga's son was. Shantanu doted on the boy, and for his part, Devrat was a perfect son. He too was absorbed in his father, soon anticipating his every wish. Devrat was mature far beyond his years. In their bond of love, the son was the stronger one. He bore the responsibility of their intense relationship. Then one day, Shantanu went hunting again. He was not lonely anymore, and he hunted far less frequently than he used to. But the habits of his youth seldom leave a man entirely, and that day Shantanu came once more to the bank of a river. It seemed that, as in the past, a river would again play a fateful role in his life. However, this other day of moment, he did not come to the Ganga. He rode instead to the banks of the Yamuna. As his charioteer led his heroes to the water to let them drink, an ineffable fragrance swept over the king, a scent of heaven that set his senses on fire. This scent on the breeze was so exciting that Shantanu had to seek out its source. As he moved towards it, he wondered what exotic flower it was, which had this effect on him. Had some Gandharv in rut dropped a garland he had made for his love from unearthly blooms? Shantanu rounded a shoulder of thick woods and found himself in a small clearing beside a bend in the river. He saw a rough hut of timber and thatch, with smoke issuing from its chimney. In front of that hut, sitting on a smooth slab of rock beside the Yamuna and dipping her feet in the midnight blue water, was a young woman so fragile and beautiful it was hard to imagine how she was here in this wilderness. As Shantanu went nearer, desire woken in him by now. He realized that the heavenly scent which had awoken his desire was the fragrance of this young woman's dark body. Some years ago, another man had found the same young woman, much as she sat today, and the Rishi Prashar had also been overcome. Though then she did not smell of heaven, but of very earthy fish. Now Shantanu stood right behind the young woman, whose name was Satyavati. He whispered, "Who are you?" She looked up at him and turned her eyes down quickly from what she saw in his gaze. The king felt faint now that he was so near her. Shantanu said again, "Who are you, lovely one? I am Shantanu, king of the Kurus, and I want you for my wife." She did not seem surprised. Her eyes still turned down to the boat tried to rock on which she sat. She said huskily, "My name is Satyavati, and my father is the king of the fishermen on the river. I ply this boat across the Yamuna as a ferry." He saw in her eyes that she was pleased with the idea of being his queen, though he doubted she knew a thing of what it would entail. "Where is your father?" he cried impatiently. She turned lissomely and pointed. He was loath to leave her for even a moment, but bending quickly to caress her cheek, he tore himself away and strode across to the fisherman's hut. Inside, the old fisher king, black with unkempt locks hanging to his shoulders, sat hunched over his midday meal, savoring the fish his daughter had smoked for him on a spit. Deftly, he separated the fish from the skeleton so no morsel fell on the ground. Without rising, the fisherman peered at his obviously noble visitor and waited for him to speak first. Shantanu was in a hurry and said, "I am Shantanu, king of the Kurus of Hastinapur. When I was hunting along the river, a scent like I had never smelt before swept over me. I followed it and found it came from a young woman. She says she is your daughter. Fisherman, I have come to ask you for her hand." The fisher king did not rise even when Shantanu said who he was. He merely listened, all the while taking the flaky flesh of the big fish's bones with the stained teeth. He squinted shrewdly at the king, then got up and went out to wash his hands. When he returned, he folded his palms to Shantanu. "Lord of the house of Somdev, my daughter could never hope to find a husband like you. I am happy to give her to you to be your queen." Shantanu gave a shout of delight, but the fisherman stopped him with a look from heavy eyes and said, "However, there is one condition I must impose, my lord, before she becomes yours." "What?" cried Shantanu, certain he could easily satisfy any greed for wealth this crude fellow might have, even in his dreams. Wiping his hands carefully on a square of rough cloth, the fisherman said, "A rishi told me that one day my daughter's son would be king of all these lands." The man's eyes shone with that prophecy he had cherished so long. "You can have my Satyavati if you give me your word that her son will be king after you. Shantanu gasped. What would become of Devrat if he agreed to this man's condition, as he so frantically wanted to? In his mind, he saw his son's face. He saw Ganga's face. He heard her say to him, "Here is your son, Shantanu. He is a Kshatriya. Take him with you to your kingdom of heroes." The day of Devrat's investiture as Yuvraj rose before his eyes. Yet the fisher girl's unearthly scent made his heart falter. Without a word and with an effort that took all his strength and all his love for his son, Shantanu turned and walked out of the hut without committing himself to the fisherman. He wrenched his treacherous gaze back from where it strayed wretchedly to the girl, who still dangled her feet in the blue river, now humming a snatch of song as sweet as the scent of her. Shantanu trembled. He dragged himself to his chariot, cried to his charioteer to ride home to Hastana, to go like the wind. But the fire Satyavati had kindled in his blood raged on. Let's stop it here. Next chapter is quite long. So we'll start with chapter 5 next week. So any question, comment? Let's do the Shanti mantra, then we can do that. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Visheshyate Om Shanti 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 Om.